In the Kremlin, bad news ends careers, so reports get cleaned up before they ever reach Vladimir Putin's desk. Rather than be honest and lose your job, it's better to soften the truth, to delay it, or to simply bury it. But after years of that, the Kremlin can no longer tell what is truly transpiring within their own country. However, when the government cannot produce reliable numbers, it doesn't just stop in the Kremlin. The economic system also feels the pinch. Credit locks up because nobody lends against data they do not believe. And that's why we see today inside Russia interest rates of 16%. When lenders cannot price risk, cash stops moving, and that affects other things. We see that Vladimir Putin demands results from his war, but Russia is burning through $500 million a day. And that's a lot of money that Russia doesn't have. So when cash gets tight, the first failure shows up where Moscow has the least amount of slack: the front lines. Look at the supply lines that stretch 1,200 kilometers, 745 miles. And very often we see that fuel exists there, but only on paper. Commanders report that they have fuel because they don't want to be punished. And that's why they send their units out to move, knowing full well that there's no reserve fuel. So when those troops begin to sputter, and nothing can be done for them because nobody's going to admit they lied earlier. They had enough fuel. But these lies, they pass over all of Russian society. Look what we see with the recruitment in the Russian military. Putin says that recruitment's great. There's many people who wish to be in the Russian military. But in fact, month over month, they're behind 9,000 men in losses. For some reason, not many people are keen to join Putin's army. One reason could be due to what we see in places like Perm, Russia. Perm used to pay $8,300 enlistment bonuses. Later, they had to drop it to $1,500, but now they're offering $0. So if the army is full of lies and lacking cash, who would want to be part of that team? Incredibly, though, this all could have been fixed had Vladimir Putin chosen to know the truth of what was really going on. But time again, we see that Vladimir Putin willfully chooses to not know what is going on. Look in 2021 when CIA Director William Burns went to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin face to face. He hoped to dissuade him of invading Ukraine. He thought that he could reason with him. Burns himself was the former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, and he'd met Putin many times before. But Putin decided to not meet him. In fact, he said that they could just do a call. But what's incredible about that is that imagine this. You have the director of the CIA who's willing to share information with you to persuade you that this will not work out well, but you're not even willing to consider discussing it with him. But that's all a sign of how Vladimir Putin operates. He chooses to stay in the dark. But Putin himself is realizing he's got some problems. And not being a very clever man, he doesn't know how to solve them. So he falls back on his KGB reflex. And that KGB reflex is to, if in doubt, tighten control. And in Russia, we see a lot of the tightening of controls. We see that in Russia, there is in fact limits on how much money you can take out of the ATM. But now they're putting limits on how much money you can take out from the teller's window. They want to make it about $650 per day. Keep in mind, and this is in a country with an inflation rate of about 14.5%. So when people cannot get cash, the Kremlin, though, is a solution. And it knows that the banks are probably not the solution because the banks don't have solutions. The Kremlin is pushing through now the digital ruble. So just imagine getting an electronic currency from the Kremlin. That allows the Kremlin to control you even more than before. They know exactly what you spend money on, where you get it from, and where you are all the time. That's the thing that appeals to Vladimir Putin's logic. He can't control the global events. He perhaps doesn't even understand them very well. But something like this, he does understand. This suits his logic. But Vladimir Putin is giving more and more power to the intelligence services. In fact, just yesterday, he signed a decree giving the Russian FSB the ability to coordinate the turnoff of the internet across Russia at any time they deem it to be necessary, both for mobile cell phones, for homes, and for businesses. This sort of control, of course, it might buy you some time, but it does not help you to pay the bills. And today, Russia is hard up for money. And in fact, Bloomberg reports that Russia just sold 300,000 ounces of gold for $1.4 billion. When reserves are not enough and you have to move this sort of a step, it's a bad sign. But it gets worse in what you see next. Since 2021, 25 of Russia's 204 Forbes listed billionaires, about 12% of the total, 1 out of 8, they faced nationalization, forced sales, or non market seizures. Taking from the elites is a pretty incredible move. Those elites had probably been very allegiant to Putin, but today there are people that Putin cares more about who need money. And so now they're shaking every tree that they can find. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin is making war decisions blind, and every day he stays blind, the damage multiplies. And ultimately, the harder that Russia will break. But even more dramatically, the harder that Vladimir Putin's regime will fall. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and a national security advisor. When I first started studying Vladimir Putin 2 decades ago, he was a lot different than he is today. He's become much more of a shut-in, and he's much more distant from day-to-day life inside of Russia. When he first came to power, he was known as being quite open-minded to meet with people like economists, for instance, to discuss good policies, to get their viewpoint. He's all but ceased those sorts of activities. He believes he knows exactly what needs to be done. And that's probably a good thing for everybody, because obviously he clearly doesn't understand what he is doing. Vladimir Putin has always, of course, been a bloodthirsty dictator. He came to power by bombing his own citizens. But there is a difference. Back then, he was a domestic terrorist. At this point, he's an international terrorist. But over time, he has centralized power. He has hardened his regime. And dissenting inputs have become dangerous to report within the Kremlin. Today, Vladimir Putin is far more isolated, and that isolation amplifies the risk that he's created for his own regime, a regime that could fracture due to the fact that these lies are piling up. And that is why the Putin regime's destiny now hangs in the balance. Russia is not strong. Russia is, in fact, a basket case. And today, that basket case is on fire. So you can help us get the truth to more people of what's really happening inside of Russia, a country that's losing to Ukraine. All I ask you to do is please like this video, share with others, put it on social media, and leave your comments below. Let us know if you like the new graphics that we're putting into these videos, the infographics made by my team. You can also please subscribe now and help us reach our goal of 275,000 subscribers. And if you have hype, the new thing on YouTube, please hype this video. Thanks. Russians themselves, like Putin, are in their own little information silo because once bad news ends careers, briefings turn into lullabies. And that is a huge problem. The Russian state makes life or death decisions using fairy tales written to protect the messenger, not to give effective information. We have seen that close insiders to Putin, like Nikolai Patrushev or Sergei Ivanov, both friends of Vladimir Putin from the KGB in Leningrad in the 1970s, have been pushed out by Putin. So that means today, Putin is not surrounded by people who he's known for decades. He's surrounded by people who are scared to tell him the truth. Consider a terrible error he made back in February 21st, 2022. It cost him the war in Ukraine, and it was before the full-scale invasion even began. Putin convened the Security Council to force public approval of the Donbass being accepted into Russia. But during that council meeting, Vladimir Putin called on the head of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Narishkin, demanding a clear answer. Should Russia's annexation of the Donbass be recognized? Yes or no? Sergei Narishkin is a longtime Putin loyalist from St. Petersburg, and he has known Putin since about 1992. He's held a lot of very senior positions in the Kremlin. Narishkin, though, he hesitated before answering Putin because he understood very well the difference between the reality on the ground and the script from which they were all reading. The situation in Ukraine would not be a joyous 3-day special military operation. Words came out of Narishkin's mouth tangled as he tried to hedge instead of committing. Putin cut him off and ordered him to speak directly. Narishkin was so overwhelmed that he answered the wrong question. Putin then snapped at him and pressed him harder. The spy chief finally gave the only safe answer when you're with Putin. I fully support your view. That scene, though, was important because it was broadcast on international television. That trained the entire elite of Russia that intelligence was not there to give you information. It was not there to explain. Intelligence is there to comply with whatever the boss says. But after that broadcast, nobody in that circle is going to risk bringing uncertainty to Vladimir Putin ever again. It's very clear that your professional assessment is not required, only your unfailing loyalty to tell the leader what he wants to hear. And this week, we'll be getting more into Nareshkin and the friends of Putin in our members' videos. So if you're not a channel member, you could become one today. So, how does this fear of upsetting Putin play out on the ground? How do we see it day to day? Well, let's just take, for instance, the attack that we just saw in Votkinsk. That plant is a strategic choke point in Russia for their entire missile industry. It is a primary producer of solid fuel ballistic missiles. That includes the RS-24 Yars and Bulava. It is tied to the Iskander missile production as well. Now, earlier today, Ukraine struck the plant using Flamingo missiles, putting the factory into a very fiery shutdown. Do you think that anyone told Vladimir Putin about this? Or is Putin too isolated and blissfully ignorant to even know that this occurred? Which raises yet another question, though. How much of Putin's hardline negotiating is really about him being a hardline negotiator, being a tough negotiator, and how much of it is really just about him being misinformed and not knowing that Russia is not winning, not knowing that Russia is not actually at war with NATO? That's just the excuse that his staff gives him to downplay their own failings. But there is something that Putin has heard about for sure, and those are drones. And if you'd like to help the Ukrainian soldiers get more drones to help save lives, check out the first comment below. Question of the day, you'll see. Right below that, you'll see a video you should really check out, so this video makes more sense. But right below that, you can donate for the Ukrainian soldiers to get what they need to come home alive and to win. And all donations are being matched right now. Thank you. So the idea that Putin is totally unaware of what's really happening is not impossible. It is really quite possible. Keep in mind, Russia commissioned polling in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. Then they promptly ignored that polling that showed the vast majority of Ukrainians did not want to join Russia. They chose instead to brief Putin with comforting fiction instead. And that is how the Kremlin works. Bad news gets filtered out, and the state drives straight into a disaster. Recently, in fact, a senior Russian military officer said on television that their polling had showed that 75% of Ukrainians wanted to join Russia. Quite clearly, that was not the case. Or take, for instance, another example. Look at Valery Gerasimov. We've seen in public events that he has posters on his wall of Russia, and they include places that are not in Russia. In fact, they were never once occupied, such as Odessa, Ukraine. So how much accurate information does Vladimir Putin really get if his own generals, his own top people in charge of the military, have these sorts of maps? Putin's lack of truthful information is triggered in part, though, by a very important detail, and that is nepotism. Projekt reported that Vladimir Putin elevated at least 24 relatives into official roles in state companies. Putin's niece is the deputy minister of defense. Her husband is the minister of energy. Family promotion is important because careers depend on the same small circle. But that's also a problem. You see, we know these people are not being chosen for their skill set. They're not being chosen to be the best and the brightest. Niccolo Machiavelli said that the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. And for Vladimir Putin, we can see who those people are. So how is Putin's relative faring there at the Ministry of Energy? Is he doing a good job? Well, just today, Russia's largest bank, VTB, is moving towards bankruptcy action against First Oil Group with a cited debt of nearly $74 million. And just hours ago, Reuters forecast that Russia will have to cut oil exports by an additional 300,000 barrels per day. Now, many people criticized Macron, the leader of France, for speaking to Vladimir Putin after the full-scale invasion had begun. But Macron made a very interesting point, which I'm sympathetic to. He said, if I do not speak to Vladimir Putin and I do not give him the truth, who will give him the truth? Clearly, nobody in the Kremlin will, and no other Western leader is willing to speak with him. But we see that Putin is oblivious to everything that's happening. Today, Ukraine is adapting, and Russia is not. Ukraine is learning and exploiting what it learns. Just in the past few days, we saw that Ukraine has regained 300 square kilometers. That's 116 square miles. Russia, meanwhile, it is certainly not advancing. Someone who's well-informed would not make such reckless decisions like Putin does. But history shows us how leaders like Putin end up. They look like the hapless leader Nicholas II. Now, he fell into this exact same trap back in 1916 to 1917. The courtiers hid bad news from him because they wanted to not face his anger. The palace, it tightened control while the country broke underneath. Denial, it bought them some extra days, but then the whole system snapped from their inaction. And that is how collapse accelerates, because the court believes its own fiction. Today, Vladimir Putin is in a bad position because a system that sees the mutiny but freezes is not a good system. But the reason it freezes is because truth is now no less treasonous than is rebellion. Check out this video for the bigger story. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.